If I've learned anything from Tolkien, it's that each of us has a path to follow, a journey to embark on, a quest. Frodo had to destroy the ring, Aragorn had to claim his crown, and me, well, I'm gonna rewrite Rings of Power. In my last video, I made a bit of a disputed claim, that at the heart of every bad story is a good one, simply placed in the wrong creative hands. And today, I'm here to back up that claim. I know I could endlessly barrage the Rings of Power with criticism, and I certainly have a few more video essays planned, but in today's video, I wanted to take a different approach. I wanted to challenge myself, to see where the show went wrong and to learn from those mistakes so as to avoid them in my own creative work. And, manage to entertain you all in the process. So today, we're going to rewrite Rings of Power Season 2, starting with episodes 1 through 4. Now, my main issues with the season so far are countless. The characters, the storyline, the plot, the pacing, the acting, the lore-breaking, Galadriel. The plot is not character-driven, but rather writer-driven. And as a result, the characters in the show range anywhere from aimless to completely foolish. There are almost no emotional stakes, and when emotions do become big enough to be relevant to the plot, they often feel rushed, which when combined with the modern sensibilities of many of the characters, just come across as melodramatic. Durin, I'm looking at you. Obviously, I think that many people agree that one of the biggest problems with the show was its main character, Galadriel. And because I think having a compelling main storyline is incredibly important, and there's just a bit too much to cover in this video, her storyline will be the primary focus of this rewrite. So with all that in mind, and sticking to the usual rules of working with the raw materials already provided by the season of the show, let's get into this rewrite. We open on a field of corpses. The world is dark and red. The field is covered with creations both dead and alive. Orcs, lost and leaderless. Strange hooded figures, acolytes of the Dark Lord, wandering mindlessly about, their faint wail echoing across the battlefield. The War of Wrath is done. Morgoth has been defeated, cast out into the void, never to return. The screams die as a singular shadow stretches across the plain, its owner a floating, sickly, regal presence. My children, do not weep, but become that which is forgotten, disappear into the annals of history, and when they have all but forgotten our ways, we will strike once more. We will bring them to their doom. The original opening showed us the fall of Morgoth, or at least the aftermath of it, and I thought this was a compelling concept. But the old actor for Sauron wasn't really cutting it, and they also tried to set up this weird rivalry backstory between Sauron and Adar, which just ended up making Sauron look entirely pathetic, easily defeated by a spiky crown and a dark elf guy. I wanted to try and rectify this, and instead open the show by instilling this feeling of dread, like a dark, impending doom. As the title fades, we see Galadriel, weeping. She's lower than we've ever seen her, and as the room grows brighter, we see that she sits, hands chained, in a guarded cell. Elrond retrieves her and brings her before the High King Gigalad, where all her crimes are revealed. She was manipulated by Sauron, and let him slip from her grasp through sheer arrogance, and for it all, she weeps. Gigalad, feeling pity for her, agrees to release her from custody, but informs her that she must remain in Lindon until a council can be formed. They must decide what to do with the rings. Messengers, not just a single messenger, are sent out to Celebrimbor to inform him of Halbrand's true identity and that the Dark Lord Sauron has returned. Meanwhile, Adar continues his conquest of the outer border of the Southlands, now Mordor. Town after town falls under their domain, submitting either to slavery or to death. Isildur, who survived the battle, is among the prisoners of this army, working as a slave. From all across Middle-earth, dark creatures, trolls, orcs, and even men stir, all headed for the rising forces in Mordor. In the actual show, there's this random side plot with Isildur. Well, Actually, his whole storyline is kind of this random side plot, but he wakes up after the battle in like a spider's lair, which is baby Shelob, and he fights baby Shelob and hurts her kind of just because. But I decided to cut this entirely, jumping further on in his storyline and kind of streamlining the plot points so as to tie into the larger narrative and kind of eliminate the unnecessary fan service. Isildur's workmate, a hobbled old man, is dragged away and brought before Adar. The orc commander presses him, promising freedom if he will only reveal what he knows. And the old man tells of his merchant trade, how he worked caravans across Middle-earth, and how the forges of Eregion had stirred with unusual activity of late. Strange ores, science, and sorcery of an ancient kind, and rumors of a second smith in the tower for an older, wiser smith. Sauron. Adar is furious, dismissing the claims as wild and delusional. But he keeps to his promise and lets the old man go. All the while, his paranoia grows. He summons his commanders, and they begin to devise a new strategy. A siege on Eregion. As the old man hobbles, his form begins to shift, growing taller, leaner, stronger, and he wanders off into the wilderness. In the meantime, the Harfoots are still with the bearded stranger. I mean, we all know it's Gandalf, right? They've made their way to the land of Rhûn, and in the villages and towns bordering the desert, they have begun to track rumors of a wizard. Trading what little goods they have, they set off into the desert at night, ill-prepared and hopeless, hoping to find the wizard before they die of dehydration. Back in Eregion, the messengers arrive, delivering the news that Halbrand is Sauron, and that the Dark Lord now roams free. Upon hearing this, Celebrimbor is cast into a fit of horror, one of the few who realize that not only had he conversed with Sauron, but that the method used to forge the rings of power was from the Dark Lord himself. As Celebrimbor is about to send a letter in reply, he pauses. He rereads the final words of the message, which state Gigalad's fascination with the rings of power, and his intention to use them, if so decided by the Elven Council. Celebrimbor's ego prevails, and he remains silent. In the wake of the Southland slaughter, Arondir weeps. After last season's finale battle, he has discovered that both Bronwyn and her son are dead. Now, I know this is almost cheating, but of all the storylines in the show, this whole single mother, cross-species romance, race allegory thing between Bronwyn and Arondir was by far the worst. And this is my way of fixing it. So, Arondir is the only one that remains. He is furious at Adar, and then furious at the elves for failing to aid the people of the Southlands. And so, he tracks the orc army, his mind set on a singular goal: revenge. While I don't have as much time to focus on them, both Khazad-dûm and Numenor are in total chaos, and for entirely different reasons. Queen Miriel is blind, and under her weak rule, a dark conspiracy begins to spread. There are rumors of a cult, a new power, a new religion which preaches restoration, freedom from the elves, and a power beyond compare. Khazad-dûm, on the other hand, has been cast into darkness. Just like in the show itself, the stirring of Mount Doom has destroyed the mirror system to the surface, causing the city's crops to die and famine to spread throughout the realm. They work to redig the holes, but in the meantime, the people starve. Durin IV begs his father to trade with the outside world, but in his dwarven stubbornness, the king refuses. At the Elven Council, it is decided that the Rings of Power were untouched by the Dark Lord's influence, and that, for the preservation of Lindon, they will be given to the strongest among the elves. High King Gigalad, Círdan, and finally, Galadriel are chosen as the bearers. Galadriel's grief is still apparent, but as she dons the ring, a new sense of self overtakes her. She stands taller, a look of pride coming across her face. She failed her people, her brother, perhaps all of Middle-earth, but this ring is her second chance. I've made a whole video about Galadriel, and while there are some issues with timelines and lore, this is just a rewrite, so I had to use what I had. To be honest, I think her storyline has potential, but in this season, just like the last, she's unlikable and inaccessible. She has a plethora of flaws and was almost more evil than good, yet the writers seemed loath to admit it. Here, I wanted to highlight that failure, complete and total. And yet, amidst that darkness, a chance at redemption. In Eregion, Celebrimbor receives news that the Rings of Power have been put to use, and that so far, their effect has been a positive one, bringing life and light to Lindon like Valinor of old. He rejoices, and as his fellow smiths and attendants set off for a night of celebration, Celebrimbor begins his work once more, for he has other plans. If he is to be the one to restore Middle-earth, to deliver it from the hands of Sauron himself, there is much work to be done, perhaps even more rings to be made. I am fascinated with a storyline about the obsession of an artist, and I think that Celebrimbor is the embodiment of this. It's his desire for praise and recognition that results in his inevitable doom. But the show portrays him as weak and foolish, and I think it's to his character's great detriment. In this version, I see him as incredibly strong, more capable than almost any elf on Earth, and it's this overconfidence which becomes his final downfall. Now, back in the desert, the Harfoots continue their journey. Their travel becomes more and more clumsy as they search for food and water. But in this delirium, it becomes apparent that they are being followed. Masked riders tracking them at a distance. Not Gandalf is concerned because his powers are still largely uncontrollable, but they have no other option but to continue onward, following the rumor and the direction of the locals. Elrond, who has continued to follow the orcs, finally loses his patience and attacks them. He doesn't stand a chance, but in the chaos of the assault, manages to free a host of prisoners, who instead of fighting with him, simply use him as a distraction and flee for the wilderness. Isildur, one of the freed, begins to run, but seeing Elrond all alone, surrounded and moments away from death, he runs back to aid the elf, and drags him off into the forest. A small group of orcs break off and follow them into the woods. In Lindon, Galadriel wakes, haunted by strange dreams. She sees Halbrand and Sauron, battles of the First Age, the death of her brother. It's as if her guilt has manifested as waking nightmares, and the central image that recurs is Celebrimbor, hammering in the darkness of his forge, hammering and hammering, but never stopping. She confesses these dreams to Gigalad, and surprisingly, he comforts her, saying that he too has been haunted by visions, though of a different nature. Magic and the skill of foresight have always been common among the elves, and it seems only reasonable that when armed with such rings of power, the strength of these abilities also increase. Galadriel fears for Celebrimbor, and the High King Gigalad for the rising darkness in Mordor. He agrees to send Elrond and an army of elves to Eregion, but wants to send Galadriel to spy on the movements of the enemy in Mordor. They must discover what Adar's plans are, and where his army plans to march next. Galadriel protests, saying that she should be the one to go to Eregion, but the High King cites her previous interactions with Sauron and the susceptibility that she has to his manipulation, and so he decides to send her to Mordor instead. Celebrimbor, now long asleep in his forge, stirs as he hears a sound. The shaking of trees unseen, a gust of wind, and a light as of the breaking dawn, creeping across the room. Meanwhile, in Numor, Miriel's father has finally been overtaken by sickness and dies. I'm very unfamiliar with the lore of Numor, but what frustrated me about this storyline was the lack of political intrigue. The politics were infantile, and I wanted to try and lean into a strange, cultish influence in the rising opposition, so that as an audience, you can feel the power of Sauron. You can see, slowly, his master plan taking shape. As Miriel prepares for her coronation, further rumors of an opposition continue, but Elendil assures her that there is still loyal support for the crown. She proceeds with the ceremony, and is utterly humiliated before the people of Numor. In the throne room, hung high from every rafter are pigs. Dead pigs, dressed in the armor of the city guard. The crowds begin to riot, yelling about foreign involvement in foreign wars, about the hundreds of lives lost in a war that was never theirs. It's at this point that Pharazôn emerges from the masses, holding the Palantir in his cloak, the one that Miriel has depended on throughout her rule. He cites black magic, elven magic, for her failure. He says that she has begun to worship the religions of the outer worlds, and that if they wish to be free of the superstition of the elves, of the Eldar, and of the olden days, they must remove her from the throne at once. In this way, Pharazôn becomes king. Arondir and Isildur, still fleeing from the troop of orcs, continue on through the forest, coming upon an almost deserted camp. Smoldering fires, open tents, neglected weapons lay all about, and a single woman remains, huddled, muttering about titan monsters and dead men. Arondir identifies the mark of Sauron and of the wild men. He is troubled, for they never venture this far north. They take the woman prisoner and follow a trail through the trampled underbrush, the path littered with bloody clothes and broken blades. The trail ends in a pit of carcasses, the bodies of the men torn apart beyond recognition. Isildur is horrified at the savagery, but Arondir seems to know its cause. He knows, and is all the more afraid. Meanwhile, the dwarven famine has worsened dramatically. Durin IV takes matters into his own hands and leaves with his wife to beg for the aid of the elves, envisioning a trade deal to spare their great city. His destination? The city of Eregion. They are met at the gates with tense hospitality. At first, Celebrimbor is nowhere to be found, locked away in his tower forge, with no one allowed in or out. Even the elves are bewildered by his strange and extreme solitude. That night, as Durin goes for a stroll, he watches the windows of the forge. He can hear voices, several voices, and in the shadows of the raging forge fire, he even thinks he sees not one figure, but two. The next day, Celebrimbor descends to meet the dwarven embassy. He looks a mess, tired, overworked, and distant, but upon hearing of the problems of Khazad-dûm, is oddly joyous. Excitedly, he presents Durin a pile of scrolls, documenting the forgery of a new set of rings, the providential solution to all their problems. Durin is skeptical of the elven magic, but agrees to consider its use, and leaves the city stocked with a caravan of food and water, a free gift from the elven smith. Celebrimbor resumes his work, locked alone in the tower forge. Galadriel and her small group of elves traverse across Middle-earth, and as they gain on Adar's army, begin recording their reconnaissance. It's clear that Adar is moving north, but his intended destination is still a mystery, so they follow. Because of her orders, Galadriel is forced simply to watch and not to fight, but her commitment is tested as the orcs descend upon another town which stands in their way, innocents falling to the torch and blade. The three elves she has brought with her move to descend upon the orcs in righteous fury, but Galadriel orders them to remain hidden. They watch and wait until the armies shift north once more, and in a moment guided by instinct and the unseen hand of her ring's foresight, Galadriel realizes their final destination. The orcs march on Eregion. As always, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this video. These rewriting videos is still kind of a new thing for me, both specifically for Rings of Power and as just kind of a new video format in general. So I would love to hear your thoughts on it. What did you guys think of my rewrite? What would you have changed about Rings of Power Season 2? And as always, keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you all in the next video.